What an honor to be part of this panel. Big thanks to you both for the great presentations, and to Nyland Heath for gathering us. The first public burial on Hart Island was carried out 148 years ago today. Louisa Van Slyke is thought to have been an orphan and an immigrant. The only facts about her that survive are that she was born at sea and 24 years old when she died at Manhattan's Charity Hospital. Other details of her life were not recorded. She recedes alongside the thousands of dead subsequently buried alongside her. Since Hart Island became a potter's field on April 20th, 1869, almost 1 million of New York City's dead have been buried there. These dead include those whose families are too poor to afford funerals, or who have no family to claim them, or claim them fast enough. Stillbirths and unidentified suicides, the victims of epidemics from yellow fever and influenza to AIDS, nursing home residents whose addresses are recorded as the subway stops, or nursing home residents whose burial wishes get lost in end-of-life bureaucracy, the homeless whose addresses are recorded as the subway stops nearest to where they die, and whose burials increase in winter when more die of exposure. In New York Times coverage from the 19th century to the present, those buried at Hart Island are called the poor waifs and strays of humanity, the city's unbefriended dead, the loneliest of all the millions who crowd this city, the unidentified or unclaimed dead. I want to propose Hart Island as a vital place to think about and to put alongside the conference themes of premature Black death and collective mourning. The way that New York City treats its manifold marginalized dead also speaks to distinctly Black histories and dilemmas, to historic segregated potter's fields like the weed-choked Florida Cemetery where Alice Walker went in 1975 to find Zora Neale Hurston's unmarked grave, to the work of Black Lives Matter activists today to name and tally those killed by police. Hart Island can be a microcosm for the many kinds of death and marginality that are and have been omitted from vision, both geographically and spiritually. Hart Island is located in the northeast corner of the Bronx, near Pelham Bay, where the Long Island Sound narrows and flows into the East River. In its early years, a ferry ran between the city morgue at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan to the island, 16 miles north. Hart Island is still an active potter's field today. About 1,500 are buried there every year in rectangular pine coffins, which are piled 3 deep into 70-foot-long trenches. Burial methods haven't changed much since the 19th century. Photographs, whether from the 1890s or the 1990s, show the same wooden crates of the dead stacked in long trenches. And at least since the 19th century, the heavy labor of these burials has been carried out by prisoners. The practice of tasking prisoners with burials of the poor in New York appears to have begun in colonial times, when the city jail and adjoining workhouse were near the African burial ground and another potter's field in lower Manhattan. For parts of its history, and as recently as the 1990s, small jails for inmate burial workers have been housed on Hart Island itself. The burials are currently carried out by inmates from Rikers Island. Serving out the end of sentences for misdemeanors, they are paid 50 cents an hour to bury the dead. Melinda Hunt, an artist and activist who interviewed inmate burial workers in the 1990s, described them as mostly young inmates convicted of misdemeanors like turnstile jumping and graffiti, that kind of thing. Young men who didn't have the resources to pay $1,000 bail to avoid going to prison. The relationship between Hart Island and race can be tricky to pin down. The race of the dead is recorded when bodies are unidentified, but not part of the records that the Correction Department has reluctantly made available to the public. So there's no way to track the demographic status of the dead or other statistics about Hart Island. In its early years, many of the dead appear to have been immigrants, and the dead at Hart Island have always come disproportionately from impoverished neighborhoods and from publicly funded hospitals and nursing homes. It's much easier to estimate the racial makeup of the inmates tasked with burying the dead. Studies suggest that the population of inmates serving time for misdemeanors on Rikers is 95% Black or Latino. So which is worse, the invisibility and inaccessibility of these deaths or of those who bury them? Reading the contemporary journalistic coverage of Hart Island shows how much the mention of incarceration has come to evoke a sort of living death in the popular lexicon. One New York Times editorial describes the practice of having inmates carry out these burials as, quote, the untouchables burying the untouchables. The inaccessible island has been described as, quote, a prison for the dead, and one mother whose infant daughter was buried on Hart Island in 1978 said, "Some cemetery visit. I felt like a prisoner," the first time she visited the island in 2013. Members of the public, including mourning relatives, were barred from visiting the island for years, a practice that changed 2 years ago when the New York Department of Correction restored limited access after a lawsuit and years of pressure from activists. The visits have proved popular. They fill up months in advance and command long waiting lists. 2 weeks ago, on Palm Sunday, I joined one of these visits. In the fields used for burial, the mass graves are marked only by sparse white concrete markers, the older ones often broken, the earth otherwise covered by a light coating of weeds. Over the decades, the inaccessibility of the dead to mourners has motivated the people who work on the island to create ad hoc monuments. White plaster statues of the Virgin Mary and cherubs stand alongside the path leading from the ferry dock to the island. They were paid for and put in by the ferry operators who wait all day at the slip while inmates conduct the burials. There are other such memorials throughout the island, a 19th century obelisk to the Civil War dead who have since been reinterred in a national cemetery in Brooklyn, a tall white tower with a cross and the word peace inscribed in the 1940s in a part of the island that's now overgrown and closed to the public, a white 10-foot cross made of wood and stones installed on a hill overlooking the mass graves in the 1980s under the direction of a corrections officer, and a conventional-looking tombstone by the road that reads, "He calleth them by name," and which was paid for by a former backhoe operator who dug the mass graves. The corrections officers who oversee the inmate work details are the ones who also escort families during the gravesite visits. At least one accompanies each group at all times, Glock on hip. They are cordial and solicitous, but a bit awkward doing work, interfacing with mourning family members, that lies far outside their usual duties. The officers stick conical containers of fake flowers in the ground of the plots being visited by families to make them easier to find. There is an astringent beauty to the quiet, windswept spaces where the graves are. In burial areas by the hill, the view opens out on the Long Island Sound where ships pass. On the southern part of the island, the Throg's Neck and Whitestone Bridge are visible in the distance. This quiet and natural beauty, compared to the notorious clamor, violence, and overcrowding at Rikers, is said to make the work detail at Hart Island one of the prison's most popular. Hart Island is one of the most remote parts of the city, and that remoteness must account for its long duration as a potter's field. It was the sixth one in New York City when it began in 1869. I sometimes think of Hart Island as part of an archipelago of sadness that stretches down the East River, from Hart Island to Rikers near LaGuardia, and to the floating jail in Hunts Point off the eastern shore of the Bronx, and to Creedmoor, the enormous part-abandoned, part-active insane asylum on the shore of Queens. This use of the city's remote islands and shoreline to house and to hide the most marginal and taboo parts of urban life extends from the present back through the past, when North Brother Island near Rikers housed hospitals where tubercular and typhoid patients were quarantined. And before it was redeveloped for housing in the 1970s, Roosevelt Island was called Welfare Island for the number of public institutions, hospitals and asylums, and a prison that it contained. Welfare Island's ubiquity through the mid-20th century as a place where the poor received medical treatment and died leaves a record in literature, a seismograph of how such places have haunted the imagination of New York's minority communities for decades. Langston Hughes' 1942 collection, Shakespeare in Harlem, features the poem, "Cabaret Girl Dies on Welfare Island." I hate to die this way, with the quiet, over everything like a shroud. I'd rather die where the band's a-playin', noisy and loud. I'd rather die the way I lived, drunk and rowdy and gay. God, why did you ever curse me, making me die this way? In 1953, Julia de Burgos, the Puerto Rican poet, spent months at the hospital on Welfare Island, ill with pneumonia and the effects of alcoholism. She wrote the poem Adios on Welfare Island, about her confinement. It has to be from here, forgotten but unshakable, among comrades of silence, very deep inside Welfare Island, my farewell to the world. She died that year and was buried on Hart Island. The history of Hart Island is ever intertwined with the marginalization of the living as well as the dead. For much of its history, less than a third of the island was devoted to the potter's field. During the Civil War, it hosted a training ground for African American regiments, an embarkation dock for military ships, and a prison camp for captured Confederates. During subsequent years, Hart Island has housed prisons and jails of various sizes, a reformatory for young offenders, a homeless shelter, and substance abuse treatment programs. Accounts of the open-air reformatory complex underscore the difference in penal regimes before the era of mass incarceration, when prison was a place to reform white men. At various points, inmates at Hart Island had a baseball team, the Hart Island Wildcats, and a prison orchestra. Hart Island is completely self-sustaining, a 1969 local history boasts, listing its resources: a clinic, a church, a butcher shop, a laundry, a commissary. Inmates raised chickens and kept a garden. The wife of the 1940s warden played the organ at church services and organized singing groups among inmates. Only once was there an attempt to make Hart Island a place for leisure. In the 1920s, Solomon Riley, a property developer originally from Barbados, bought a 4-acre tract at the southern tip of the island, which he planned to make an amusement park for New York's African American community, who were banned from the whites-only amusement parks at Rye and Dobbs Ferry. It can be difficult to get the straight story about Solomon Riley, also known as Millionaire Riley, whose status as a rich, powerful black man inspired enmity and rumor in jazz-age New York. Did he amass his fortune through an early form of blockbusting, charging middle-class black tenants a premium during a housing shortage? Or did he exact the premium from whites who paid exorbitant sale prices to buy buildings he owned and keep their neighborhoods white? Quote, a racket to shake the white residents down, in the words of one 1936 source. One account has him threatening to open a beach for black swimmers on Long Island and taking a buyout from the white owners of a neighboring estate. What seems certain is that he was preparing to open the resort on Hart Island, dubbed the Negro Coney Island by the white press, on July 4th, 1925. Riley had built a dance hall, 8 boarding houses, and a 200-foot boardwalk, and converted an old ice boat into a bathing pavilion. He was about to buy a fleet of 60 motorboats to ferry visitors to the island when the city became concerned that the resort would invite, quote, escape attempts, smuggling, and unrest among the prisoners on Hart Island. Perhaps it's more poignant that an island containing an active prison, workhouse, and Potter's Field came close to being the era's only summer resort for New York's black community. The city condemned the land and bought it back from Riley for 4 times what he had paid for it. That part of the island was later used to bury some of the first victims of the AIDS epidemic, buried 14 feet deep because of fears about the disease. During the second half of the 20th century, the institutions housed on Hart Island were all gradually closed down. A cluster of crumbling 19th and 20th century buildings are now visible near the ferry. Ruins of the brick Catholic church and Art Deco administration building have pocked windows and caved-in roofs. As buildings have closed, more parts of the island have begun to be used for burial plots. White row markers startle out of newly made clearings. The last tenant, the Substance Abuse Treatment Center Phoenix House, was closed in 1976. The faded black and white outline of a phoenix is still visible on the weathered brick. Some of the newest burial plots on Hart Island lie alongside it, where old buildings have been demolished to make way for more mass graves. The recently upturned earth is pale brown, scarred by the tire prints of trucks. Hart Island raises profound questions about how we can mourn deaths that are marginalized, unclaimed, unnamed, or unmourned by conventional means. Derek Sutton, an inmate burial worker interviewed by Melinda Hunt in the 90s, told her, to commemorate the people of Hart Island would be nice, but senseless in a way. It would be more proper to commemorate the island because the island is a God-given gift. Hart Island has given a lot by putting up a place for our dead and unknown, and all credit should go to the island. And to the inmates, I might add, who carry out burials and reckon with deaths that are otherwise hidden from view. I have come to wonder if Rikers and Hart Island are mere images of each other, places on the periphery of the city that are ignored by and that somehow also allow New York's growth as an increasingly expensive and developed city, as though each luxury apartment corresponded to a cell block and grave trench on some spiritual level. Hart Island and Rikers, the picture of Dorian Gray rotting in the city's attic, even as New York's wealth puts pressure on this periphery. By the ferry dock on City Island in the Bronx, across the little channel from Hart Island, a former salvage yard is being developed into condominiums, where the 4 bedrooms will start at just under $1 million. Is a place like Hart Island part of New York's future or of its past? New York City's current mayor, Bill de Blasio, recently announced a plan to close Rikers in the next 10 years, replacing it with small prisons in each of the 5 boroughs with good transit access that would be easier for families to visit. In recent years, bills have also floated around to make Hart Island part of the Parks Department rather than corrections, to make it accessible and visible for families and the larger public. Other American cities cremate the unclaimed dead. For all the ways that Hart Island is a holdover from 19th century methods of burial and incarceration, I've begun to wonder if the space the island holds for the dead also contains something for New York's future. The city presently displaces the work of dealing with these deaths onto largely minority inmates, but the questions of how to mourn and invent new burial rites and new rituals, new roll calls for the prematurely dead, the marginalized dead, those who die outside traditional structures, are questions for the ethic of our communities and our city that we must sooner or later face collectively. In his 1930s poem, Kids Who Die, Langston Hughes tallies the young activists who die organizing sharecroppers in Mississippi and workers on the streets of Chicago and in the orange groves of California. When he addresses these kids, who, in the language of the poem, die in perpetual present tense, Hughes recognizes that their bodies may, quote, be lost in a swamp or a prison grave or the potter's field. He locates the charge of continuing their work to liberate and to love, not just in improving conditions for the living, but in appreciating and retrieving the lost dead, assuring them, the day will come, you assure yourselves that it is coming, when the marching feet of the masses will raise for you a monument of love. Thank you.